Hello and welcome to the Street Crime UK YouTube channel. Please don't forget to like, share, comment and subscribe. Today we're going to take a look at the case of the 40 Elephants or the 40 Thieves gang, which were a 19th to 20th century all-female London crime syndicate who specialised in shoplifting. The gang was notable for its longevity and its skill in avoiding police detection. The 40 Thieves operated from Elephant and Castle in the London area, and they were allied with the Elephant and Castle mob led by the McDonald brothers. They raided quality stores in the West End of London and ranged all over the country. The gang was also known to masquerade as housewives for wealthy families before ransacking their homes, often using false references. They were in existence from at least 1873 to the 1950s, with some indications that they may have existed until the late 18th century. During the early 20th century, the gang was led by Alice Diamond, known variously as the Queen of the 40 Thieves, and as Diamond Annie, and as a friend of Maggie Hill, sister of the gangster Billy Hill. Their heyday was in the interwar period, when the gang raided on a large scale, not only on the West End of London, but also in other major shopping centres across the country. They also forced smaller gangs to pay a tribute on what they had stolen, and would punish criminals who did not obey their rules. The gang had its own set of rules and demanded loyalty from its members, and in others of their supply and distribution network. Alice Diamond ruled with absolute authority, with the cooperation of Maggie Hill, Gertrude Scully, the Partridge Sisters, and many others. Over 70 direct members of the gang, operating in the 1920s and 1930s, have been identified. Reports that the gang collapsed when their leaders were jailed for the 1925 Battle of Lambeth were incorrect. The gang was still in existence after World War II, as new family members replaced the old hands. They were often said to be able to meet equal numbers of men in battle, and were admired by their male counterparts in the Elephant Gang for their organisation and expertise. One member of the gang, Lillian Goldstein, or Nee Kendall, was known to the police as the bobbed-haired bandit, the lover of Elephant Gang associate Ruby Sparks, and driver on his smash-and-grab raids. It is unclear how long the gang operated. The earliest mention of the gang in the newspaper dates to 1873, but police records from London indicate that the female shoplifters had been active in the area since the late 18th century. The original gang members wore women's clothing, which was modified to include hidden pockets. They could hide their loot in their coats, cummerbunds, muffs, skirts, bloomers and hats. They raided large stores in the West End of London. Due to the prudish attitude of the era, female customers were afforded privacy from the store staff, giving female shoplifters the opportunity to escape notice. The gang stole goods worth thousands of pounds. The female gang members earned enough money to financially support their male spouses. The spouses in question included both idle men who lounged at home and inmates of the British prison system. The gang eventually became well known to the area, and especially with the high-class shops which they typically targeted. Their mere presence would cause panic, eliminating the secrecy for requirement in their activities. Their response to this challenge was to expand their activities from London to other British towns, where they were much less known. They targeted rural areas and seaside towns. During the 20th century, the gang modernised their activities. They invested in fast cars to transport their loot, and to use as getaway vehicles which they could outrun the police. The loot was transferred through the British railway system. The members used the trains to travel to a town and deposited their empty suitcases at the railway stations. During their return trip, the suitcases were filled with stolen goods. Besides shoplifting, the gang developed sidelines such as looting houses and blackmailing individuals. Gang members used false reference letters to get hired as maids and then rob the houses of their employers. They also managed to seduce men into brief affairs and then blackmailed them with threats of ruining their reputations. By the 1920s, the gang members started imitating the so-called Bright Young Things group, whose exploits appeared in popular press. The gang members led extravagant and decadent lifestyles by imitating the exploits of the era's movie stars and flappers. Part of their earnings was used to finance party events and spend lavishly at clubs, pubs and restaurants which the gang members frequented. The gang was particularly territorial of their turf. Other shoplifters who stole from their shops on their turf were forced to pay the gang a percentage of their takings. If the intruder refused to pay, the gang arranged beatings and kidnappings for the offenders until the payment was received. While various gang members were arrested and convicted at times, their prison sentences tended to be short. They could be sentenced to either 12 months or penal labour of 3 years of incarceration. Once released, they returned back to the gang. Several members remained with the gang for a relatively long time. Gang member known as Ada Wellman was initially arrested in 1921 and was still with the gang and arrested for another offence in 1939. While the gang members often stole clothing items, they typically did not wear the stolen clothes. Their loot was distributed to a network of fences, street market traders and pawnbrokers. Part of the stolen clothing items were sold to clothing stores, which simply replaced the labels and modified their designs. Some of the fences associated with the gang were also arrested, but could not be convicted. Ada McDonald was arrested and suspected of offence in 1910. She used the ledgers of a suspected authenticity to convince the authorities that the goods in her possession were the products of a legitimate financial transaction. Jane Durrell, another suspected fence, and her common-law husband Jim Bullock were both placed on trial in 1911. The jury decided that the police evidence against them was insufficient and they were acquitted of the charges and released. One afternoon in 1915, a group of elegantly dressed women arrived in hired cars at the prestigious Selfridges department store in London. They were dressed in furs, jewels and expensive dresses, and the staff treated them as if they would any upscale female customer. Given the error's prudish ways, this meant ignoring the women in order to allow them to try on clothes in privacy. It was only after the women had left that the staff realised these women had shoplifted a fortune's worth of gems, furs and clothing. These were no ordinary shoppers. They were members of London's first documented all-female gang, the 40 Elephants, also known as the 40 Thieves. The 40 Elephants were established in the 1870s when the female thieves of South London organised to remove themselves from the control of the male-dominated Elephant and Castle mob. The men's gang had occasionally worked with women as accomplices, but the smaller role meant that a smaller cut of earnings were given out. Schism was overseen by the artist model and expert thief named Mary Carr, who became the queen of the new gang. The Elephant and Castle gangsters agreed to provide protection and occasional assistance to the 40 Elephants in an exchange for a portion of their earnings. Miss Carr's expertise was in hoisting, stealing goods, then reselling them through fences. The gang's goal was never to retain the items they had stolen, but to become rich by selling them to third parties. Acquired most of their goods through shoplifting, seducing and blackmailing influential men, and conning their way into jobs as housemaids, only to loot the homes where they worked. The gang focused primarily on the theft of gems, jewellery, furs and fashion items. With the money they made through resale, purchased even more expensive items for themselves, never wearing what they had stolen. Alice Diamond, an even more formidable woman, succeeded Miss Carr as the Queen in 1916. Miss Diamond had been a skilled shoplifter since her childhood. She was known to wear diamond rings as a makeshift brass knuckle. This was her way of displaying her love for glamour and her love for violence. She was striking, powerful, and stood at 5'9", in a time where the average man was probably about 5'6". The other thieves, most of whom were much older, fell in line behind her leadership skills and vision. She intuitively knew the effect of styling could have on their chances for success. And under her influence, the 40 Elephants became known for their decadent excess and trendy expensive attire. Media attention increased along with their coffers. Miss Diamond effectively reorganised the gang by splitting them into separate cells. This allowed for simultaneous robberies to occur in various parts of the city, dividing the police's attention and catching shopkeepers by surprise. She created a Hoisters Code, a code of conduct that outlined the democratic manner in which the gang had operated, including provisos detailing the equal division of money from the heist jobs, an expectation for the gang to care for family members of an imprisoned thief, and for the women to always provide alibis for each other. Miss Diamond also codified an expectation of absolute loyalty, and it was punishable by ridicule or beating when disobeyed. While her guidelines were strictly enforced, so too were a number of other rules ensuring the smooth operation of the criminal syndicate, such as one forbidding theft or money or boyfriends among the members. The group's shared treasury was used to assist members in trouble and pay for lawyers, as well as to fund extravagant lifestyles. Members in the gang were akin to being part of a union with unusually fair benefits for all. Miss Diamond was ruthless in protecting her gang's territory. Should an outsider steal from a shop in their area. They demanded that the interloper pay a percentage of their taking. If an offender refused, the gang would beat and sometimes kidnap until they agreed to pay the terms. The media's portrayal of the 40 Elephants continued to expand their legend, and their enemies continued to underestimate them. The newspapers wrote about Miss Diamond and her gang as gorgeous party girls, but the women were just as brutal as other street gangs. Glamour was both a goal and a smokescreen for the 40 Elephants, through which they created their own thrilling world of fashion, money and fame. In the 1920s, the 40 Elephants reached the pinnacle of their success and notoriety. Miss Diamond instituted numerous clever tricks into the gang's arsenal, ensuring that all thieves were equipped with secret pockets and flaps in their gowns to facilitate shoplifting. They were also early adopters of automobiles, making their getaways in the most glamorous of models. They confounded police by handing off stolen goods to an unseen accomplice on foot before dashing off in a high-speed car chase. Police were left befuddled when they caught up with the car and found it devoid of any stolen goods. Cars also allowed the members to expand their operation outside of London to nearby towns. All the better once Miss Diamond and other faces became too well known to the local law enforcement agencies to go incognito. Ultimately, Miss Diamond was undone by her interesting fixation on controlling the gang. The Hoisters Code forbade members from doing anything against Miss Diamond's wishes, including marrying men she did not approve of. When a member defied her in 1925, Miss Diamond led the gang in a brutal attack against the newlyweds, so destructive that it became known as the Lambeth Riot. For her role as the instigator, Miss Diamond was sentenced to 18 months in prison. By the time she was freed, a new queen had taken over. Miss Diamond turned to a career of managing a brothel, while still offering advice to young aspiring thieves. One of her proteges, Shirley Pitts, was acknowledged the queen of the gang in the 1960s. Miss Pitt's operation was on a smaller scale than that of her mentor. Changing fashions made it harder to stow shoplifted loot inside clothing as stores increased security and surveillance. The 40 Elephants officially disbanded upon Miss Pitt's death in 1992, but membership and activity have been in decline for decades. By the time of Miss Pitt's passing, the 40 Elephants were a folk legend rather than the active threat. Yet the 40 Elephants remain one of the most successful and longest lasting criminal organisations in English history. While men gangs rose and fell around them, Miss Carr and Miss Diamond's ruthless efficiency and canny leadership allowed for their group to thrive. Miss Diamond's gang stormed into department stores so many times that the staff grew to recognise her and knew to keep watch. Ever flexible, she knew her own notoriety and, to her advantage, turned herself to distracting to a lesser known member to rob them unnoticed. Her mentorship grew in future generations of female thieves, providing both a role model and a route for lower class girls to achieve independence. Thank you for joining us today. What are your opinions on the 40 Elephants gang? Please let us know what you think in the comments below. Thank you for joining us today. If you enjoyed this content, please don't forget to like and share, and if you're new to the channel and want to see more Street Crime UK content, press subscribe and hit that bell so you can join us on the next video. Thank you for joining us.